Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. It seems like everything in Mexico today is about politics. Politicians, experts, and journalists have been absorbed in the electoral process. Today, we're going to get a slightly different view, a writer's point of view. Jorge Zepeda Patterson is a Mexican sociologist, journalist, and novelist, and he's just written a new novel called Muerte contra Reloj, a murder mystery that takes place in the Tour de France. Thank you very much for joining us here on Interviews from Mexico, Jorge.
Thanks to you, Laura. It's my pleasure.
Jorge, this novel is your fourth, and you've taken the action from Mexico, where you wrote a series about Los Azules, the violence that's taking place in here in Mexico, to France. How did you make this decision to write a novel about the Tour de France?
Well, actually, yes. My first three novels were political thrillers, and they dealt with topics like corruption, abuse of power, public security, and daily political scandals, let's say. So, first of all, I wanted to take a break, a rest from being immersed in the sewers of politics. And also, I should also say that my first three novels were translated to several languages. And when I did promotion in other countries, I was always labeled as the Mexican who's writing about these terrible Mexican stories.
And there's a lot of that now. Much of it kind of falls into cliches of sensationalism, of crime and corruption. There's kind of a cliche in general regarding Mexico abroad in some ways.
Absolutely. I even got the impression from foreign journalists in France, in Italy, who asked if Mexico, maybe we were walking down the street and we had to throw ourselves to the ground twice a day because there's a shootout. And I wanted to try my hand at writing a novel with a different kind of fiction, a fiction that doesn't derive from or don't depend on my experience as a journalist, from my interactions with the political class, who I've spent a lot of time around all these years, and that instead exercise fiction, of course with the necessary research, but it's a work of fiction, and it being an international story. That was my challenge. So it was a mix of taking a break from political literature, literature about social reality, and to do something different. Basically, a novel that had a more classic style of pure mystery.
Well, tell us a little about the plot. It's international. You have a Colombian protagonist, a number of different nationalities. No spoilers.
Well, I was very interested in telling the story in the context of the Tour de France because I think cycle racing as a discipline is one of the sports that demands the most sacrifice of an athlete. Doing the Tour de France is almost like doing a marathon every day for 21 days, and to cover 3,500 kilometers at very high speed. That demands a huge sacrifice for the athletes. And so I became interested in how to write a novel with tension and suspense, with human passions, with also with all that magnified by the passions created by this level of sacrifice, ambition, self-flagellation, And as it says in one fragment of the novel, when cyclists go down, they descend from the summit at speeds of 80 to 90 kilometers an hour, willing to kill themselves. Why shouldn't they be prepared to die, or to die killing or murder? And so the plot of the novel is based on this logic. We have two cyclists who knew each other as teenagers and became inseparable friends, almost brothers. They became a very successful professional partner in cycling. They win everything. The problem is that only one of them actually wins. He is the champion. His name is Steve Panata, who's a kind of a Lance Armstrong of sorts, but without the drugs. But he wins, always wins. He's like the golden boy of cycling. But to a great extent, he wins thanks to his partner, who is my central character, Mark. He's a French Colombian, and he is hugely talented for cycling. And all the time, he's his helper, his domestique, as they call it in cycling. That means he's the one who protects him. He takes care of him, helps him conserve his energy so he can get to the end and win. Until one day, Mark, the squire, the Sancho Panza of this pair, discovers that he's probably a better cyclist than his friend, and maybe it's time for him to start getting something back. And that happens when there's a criminal manipulating the results of the race. So at some point, in the middle of the tour, or a little bit before, the police discovers that there has been a series of accidents that, as it turns out, weren't really accidents. The main one is when they find a cyclist's body. And the police conclude that these incidents, these accidents, are really crimes and could only have been committed by one of the men in the group. The criminal is one of them. And they choose Mark, the French Colombian, as their detective, their men inside.
Undercover.
Yeah, undercover, because he had been in the military police when he did his military service. So the authorities think of him as one of them. So this poor guy, Mark, is going to be in the middle of all the tension of participating in the race, the team's goal of making its leader the champion, and he is his best friend, and then suddenly he discovers that he could be the champion of France, but first he has to fight the criminal before he becomes one of the victims. And the idea is really to do kind of an Agatha Christie plot, like one of those classic European novels where there is a suspect who is one of us. That is in contrast to some of the more contemporary movies or novel plots about serial killers, where there's someone killing people and the murderer could be anyone and their next victim could be anyone. In this case, it's a close group. It's one of us, one of the faces that we see. He is the criminal, and we have to discover who it is.
Well, moving to today, you have a series of columns in the newspaper El País and have been writing consistently about the Mexican elections there. One of the recent columns is called Patriotic Fraud. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by patriotic fraud, and do you think it's a possibility in these elections?
Well, yes, there are two questions. The first, I would say, the so-called patriotic fraud is this argument made in certain sectors of the right that the left-wing candidate, López Obrador, he is the front runner in the polls right now, and well, this candidate, López Obrador, is a danger for Mexico, and that he could make things be like something what happened in Cuba or Venezuela. That's what some of these conservative sectors think. So in this context, they would say a patriotic fraud will be justified. That would mean that stealing the election from López Obrador will be doing something good for our country. Of course, it's a way of seeing things that's anti-democratic, yeah. And as I say in my column, one of these people will say, between democracy and love for my country, I choose love for my country. And that will be one of the perverse, let's say, perverse justification for this position. But they exist. They exist. And that will be the patriotic fraud, self-justification to defend certain interest in the name of the supposed wellness of the country.
You mentioned that because of the lead in all the polls that López Obrador has, we're not talking about a situation like in the past where the candidates go into the elections with a smaller margin of lead, that would require almost a coup d'etat on the part of the ruling class to do that.
Yeah, that's just the issue that your second question gets at. A fraud is possible in the country? Is there interest in a patriotic fraud in some sections? Of course.
And precedents.
Exactly. Second, are there real possibilities of carrying it out? I would say not. Like you say, Laura, if this were a closer election, with a technical tie in the polls, with López Obrador ahead by a margin of only 2 or 3 or 4%, that will be a small enough margin that there could be a kind of political maneuver and operations in the elections that aren't completely protected in our country, unfortunately. I'm saying that the electoral machinery, the electoral process has a lot of imperfections, and usually those imperfections work in the favor of the vested interest. These imperfections are significant enough that they could make an election with a small margin of difference competitive. It probably happened like that in 2006, when, as we know, Felipe Calderón, the candidate at that point of the party in power, won literally by a hair, by 0.5% to López Obrador. Even though the polls gave López Obrador an advantage of 2 or 3 or 4% the days before the election. Now, on the other hand, we're in a totally different situation. López Obrador has practically a 2-to-1 advantage over his opponents. If you add up second and third place candidates, they barely tie with him, or even are still below him in some polls. Andrés Manuel's advantage is from 25 to 30 percentage points, which represent about 13 or 14 million votes, which even in an imperfect electoral democracy, or let's be honest, an electoral pseudo-democracy, that's too many votes to create with a fraud. So I would say that the possibility of an electoral fraud is totally beyond the abilities of the regime's political operators right now.
And do you think there's any possibility that something more violent could occur in that scenario?
I think that the only really possibility of violence will be if López Obrador's advantage were smaller. Then there would be the temptation to carry out a fraud, because in effect it would be practically a coup d'etat. The reaction to a situation like that, which López Obrador described as letting the tiger out, I think that could have provoked outbreaks of violence among the more radical elements of popular sectors that feel that finally the political moment has come for the left to take a turn in power. That in response to such an obvious, conspicuous and brutal fraud, at least some sectors could respond violently. I think that this has been more or less resolved. Rather, I think it has been neutralized by what I was saying, the huge advantage that López Obrador has in the polls.
Well, let's talk about that margin, because one of the other things you say is that this is the third run for the presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and that in the past, being against the system worked against him. They were able to present him as this danger to Mexico, but that in fact, this time around, it's something that's working for him, that because that he's managed to change the fear into anger. What's happened in Mexican society that's kind of flipped that situation?
Well, that's a great question, or thesis, or observation, because I remember the allegory people used regarding Ronald Reagan, that I think applies to López Obrador too, even though they have opposite views on politics. For decades, people say that Ronald Reagan was one bird in a flock that never changed his direction, while the other birds flew this way and the other, following the leader of the day. He kept flying in the same direction until one day he realized that all the other birds were lined up behind him, and he made it to the presidency. It seems to me that López Obrador, other than a few modifications, hasn't changed much since 2006 and 2012 to 2018.
Because some people say that he's moved to the center in order to broaden his base.
I think he's modified himself a little, but he's pretty much the same. Basically, he's still the same. In effect, his last two defeats have led him to try to make like a Noah's Ark that's a little more expansive, let's say, with regard to who he lets in the party, but he's still the same. What has changed a lot is the country, at least in two senses. First, that the population feels it has exhausted the other political alternatives. They did it in 2000 with Vicente Fox from the National Action Party, and they repeated in 2006 with Felipe Calderón, also from the PAN, the center-right or right. Those were 12 years that left a lot of frustration in public opinion. Those two presidents have very low approval ratings when their mandates ended. And in 2012, when the political alternative of the right had been exhausted, the public chose a return of the Revolutionary Institutional Party, supposedly a PRI with a new face and a modernized attitude. And that was Enrique Peña Nieto from 2012 to 2018. The disappointment is very clear now. Peña Nieto is breaking records for low approval ratings since we've been keeping track.
One of the last polls, yeah, is like 77%.
So, on the one hand, there's a very clear feeling among voters that everything has been tried except for a left-wing political option. And that idea gives López Obrador the benefit of the doubt. For many voters, especially people in the center. And the second factor is what changed, and this illustrated by the phrase, "Now we are more angry than afraid." That is, than afraid of a supposed threat to Mexico that this left-wing candidate might represent. In what sense? The country has fallen apart over these years, especially in terms of public safety and corruption. Even if there have been a modest improvements in the economy, much smaller than the expectations created by Peña, and both Felipe Calderón and especially Peña Nieto promised growth rates of 6 to 7% yearly. But we have had growth rates between 2 and 2.5% on average in his administration. But the main thing that affected the situation was the sense of insecurity and people being fed up by corruption. Both factors got a lot worse in the last few years. In 2007, we broke a record for violence, and in 2008, we did it again. And the feeling in the country is that we're getting up to our limit of tolerance with the population. And there are more corruption scandals than there have been in the modern Mexican history. So, in this environment, the fear campaign that the systems and the right launched against López Obrador in 2006 and 2012, telling people that he was an anti-system candidate, an anti-institutional candidate, all that worked really worked in 2006 and 2012. And people choose to vote for the security of a candidate of the system. I think that now, in 2018, the people realize too late that a fear campaign is actually working in López Obrador's favor, because the more the parties insist that he is an anti-system candidate, the more it reassured at least half of the voters that he is what they want, that he is their candidate, that we need an anti-system candidate because of the system simply has failed.
You can see why it would be a political boomerang in this context.
Absolutely.
People are more frightened of the reality than they are of that uncertainty factor that seemed to have worked in prior elections. I want to throw in another factor. In 2017, you wrote in a collection on Donald Trump, The Apprentice. And given what you learned, what you know about Donald Trump, especially focused on his personality and his politics, do you think there's any possibility that the Trump administration will attempt to meddle in these elections?
No lo creo.
Oh, no, I don't think so. Because I get the idea that for Donald Trump, foreign policy is actually domestic policy. So I don't see him having the political intelligence that's needed to influence the Mexican election. It's needed a lot more subtlety, sensibility to be able to pull the strings necessary to change the outcome of an election. And I don't think that the Trump administration has that kind of infrastructure, that kind of tools. They probably have some sort of a stick that they might ready to use, like Trump just suggested with the commercial tariffs. And that could affect Mexico, but only externally. It couldn't affect the internal processes.
It seems that they don't have the team either. There's been so much turnover. There's no ambassador in Mexico at the moment. So,
yeah, it seems to me that they don't have the channels that they would need. The connection to the business sector, connections to the political right, to the political class in general. I don't see the White House having the political resources they need to interfere directly in the Mexican elections.
Going back to the patriotic fraud and this concept of at least a part of the right, that López Obrador is a danger, probably more to their interest than to the society at large. But do you think that there's a possibility that, along with what's become a transnational elite, there would be an effort to undermine a López Obrador presidency?
From the White House or from the Mexican business class, the Mexican elite?
I think that there's a high degree of unity now between those. With the North American Free Trade Agreement. But let's start with the Mexican ruling class.
No, I think that the Mexican business elite basically has a practical outlook. In fact, in the last few days, the last few weeks, when we started to López Obrador victory is inevitable, we started to see that a lot of bridges were being built. And I would make an observation about that. Some have been convinced by the argument that López Obrador is a danger, a threat for Mexico. But most of the business class understand that as a campaign slogan to prevent him from winning. But once it became clear that he would win regardless, they see López Obrador for who he truly is. I mean, he's not essentially radical. When we look at his team, well, his campaign chief is an important former member of the right PAN party, Tatiana Cloutier, and his economic advisor is one of the most important businessmen from Monterrey. And two former presidents of the PAN are supporting him. And half of his cabinet, his Secretary of Education was Secretary of the Interior for Cedillo, Esteban Moctezuma, etc., etc. So his team isn't made out of former leftist militants or social and political activists. They exist there, but they're not even a majority in the party. Andrés Manuel's political reference have been very little to do with socialism or communism. They are more related with a moral ethic in favor of the vulnerable class, more in ethical terms than as a political doctrine. If you look at López Obrador's records as mayor of Mexico City, you see a very progressive politician, but a very practical one, who has no problem working with the business sector in projects that he wants to get done, like the remodeling of Mexico City's historic center that was done hand in hand with businessmen, or the race highway systems around the city, a very ambitious project that he started, that was done with the help of the private construction companies. And now we can see a group of advisors to López Obrador that are part of the national and international financial sector. The attitude of the big television companies in this country, who spearhead the interest of the network of the elite, especially Televisa and TV Azteca, they both have totally changed their attitude to López Obrador starting a few weeks ago. That's totally different from 2006 and 2012. And that reflects that the business sector in this country are negotiating to ensure the stability of Mexico the day after the elections. And I would say that Wall Street is involved too. Mexico is the 50th largest economy in the world, and similar in size to Spain, and it's also next door neighbor to the metropole, the largest economy in the world. And Mexico is too important in the world stage to allow us to have the luxury of becoming unstable just to show that the right was right.
Not like Honduras, where we did see a fraud, but no, Mexico is quite a different story.
And finally, I will say that really a López Obrador victory could lead to some millionaires moving additional capital to New York or Miami because in fact they already have money there. But their businesses, the main source of their businesses is physical. It's hotels, hospitals, tourist development, real estate, industry, etc. And they can't take those to Miami or Arkansas because those places don't have the competitive advantages, the conditions of profitability that exist here in Mexico. So these businessmen will also be negotiating the next day, and they'll be negotiating with López Obrador.
So we're seeing a scenario where people are getting used to the idea as we go into the final stretch before the elections. Jorge, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the show. Congratulations on your book, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.